Hi, thanks, Viv. Can you hear me?
We've been here, we can't see you.
That's good. Yeah, I'm not in my normal setting of the city. I'm in the bush. So connectivity is difficult and there are monkeys on the roof, so I compete with all kinds of things. Did you want me to did you want me to start sharing or do you want me to just greet?
Show of the monkeys.
Are you sure? Let's see if it works.
That's you.
Okay.
Start
Can I
your
do you
time.
think I'll be able to share my screen?
You should be able to. Um, can you, I'm usually check so that people.
Yes, it's already clicked. Multiple
See?
participants can share simultaneously.
They should be able to share.
Share. Um, can you see that?
Coming. Yes, we can.
Yes.
Yeah. Very good. We're not seeing
You
you.
see it? Okay, great. Oh, thank you so much. All right. Thank you so much, Viv. It's wonderful to. I wish I was there with good friends. I have great respect for the Center for Urban Mission, Simon Peter and the team, of course, Sheth and Nancy and others, and great at this stage. It's strange, Viv, that we have never met in person. So wonderful to be here. I will try to just stay within the minutes you have given me. And I won't strictly only speak about the urban Africa. I want to show you four pictures of what we try to do in our approach, and hopefully it contributes somewhat to the conversation. I just call it finding, fostering, and celebrating transformational urban leadership. And I choose those words deliberately because often those leaders are in places already doing amazing work. They're not always recognized by the status quo and our theological institutions as leaders, and yet they do remarkable work where many of us fear to tread. So to find those, but also to foster leadership and also to celebrate those who are actually in spaces making change. Now I struggle here to move to the next slide. Okay. So I just want to show you four pictures. The one is of an approach that we follow around homelessness and housing in the city of Tshwane or Pretoria. And I thought that connects also a bit to your next conversation. Speak in two slides or so about a one-year program we offer. And some people in Nairobi participated in that, Leadership in Urban Transformation. Then I want to say a little bit about our distinct, well, I think not distinct, but our research approach in our center. And then I will wrap up by saying something about Urban Africa 2050, which I think is the closest synergy to the vision behind this gathering as well, to multiply urban leadership across the continent. But maybe let me just give a moment of background. I grew up, like all South Africans, in the apartheid city, um, separated based on race. And in a real sense, for the last 30 years, some of us have sensed a call of participating in what we speak of as undoing the apartheid city theologically, conceptually, but also spatially, and probably also psychologically, because we've internalized it. And so it's really a process, and it's been a process, and it's still a process of what I want to call healing justice at a personal, communal, organizational, congregational, structural level, but also in terms of our paradigms. And it's the whole time this movement between the center and the margins. Now, one of the interesting things post-apartheid is the new proximities between the centers and the margins. They say in South Africa, the two fastest growing settlements are gated communities of wealthy elite people, Gulf estates and things like that, and urban informal settlements. And whereas in the past, these were far from each other, post-apartheid, they are right next to each other. And so one of the questions is, how does faith function when the proximities between rich and poor have become so visible? There's also a real change in Christian landscape over the last 3 decades in relation to changing social and spatial landscapes. The face of the church is changing completely in South African society. One of the questions in our work is always, who are the actual city makers? And we are quite intentional to try and make visible the invisible, the informal, the precarious, the excluded, who are often the city makers, often because of the lack of attention or investment or priority in certain communities. And then finally, as background, um, borrowing from the book title of Parnell and Peterson, who wrote about what they call Africa's urban revolution, because for the first time in history, we are on the fastest urbanizing continent today. And yet, the urban majority, the 62% of urban dwellers living in informal urban settlements on the continent, is not theologically and politically centered. And how do we attend to that? So that's just the background. 4 pictures. The first one around homelessness and housing, and I shared that because I don't think it's disconnect how we do theology. It shouldn't be. Sometimes it is. When we think homelessness, we think charity. Um, how do we actually center it even in our theological education? And so just we theorists, and we started to think of these 4 generations of development when we think about our housing approaches. The church historically would often respond to a housing crisis through relief. So Corton speaks of these 4 generations, and then I will fill it out for a moment. The first generation being relief, the second generation, when we realize we can't just do relief, we get involved in community development. Uh, the third generation is when we realize even that doesn't always go far enough because there are structural constraints. And so the importance to also be involved in advocacy and policy work. And then even that, Corton says, often doesn't go far enough. And the fourth generation of development in his mind is when we start to be connected, not only locally, but also regionally, globally, when social and other movements connect globally to make change. Now, in our context, it started to play itself out over the last few years in a couple of ways. So relief will represent the work that many faith-based people and other people do on the streets, through temporary shelters and transitional housing, through drop-in facilities, through a beautiful street medicine program that actually gained momentum during COVID-19. But that cannot be all we do. And so there's also been a slowly developing movement around a right to housing and the question of who has a right to housing, who has a right to the city. And that expressed itself in some expressions of churches even developing social housing, developing communal housing, developing so-called housing first programs for people who are chronically ill or chronically homeless. But it also focus on supporting the in situ upgrading of informal settlements instead of displacing people. So that is something that happens in our city. But then there's also a group of people, we sometimes think of them as accidental activists. It's simply residents of informal settlements and urban slum areas that just purely because they have to live and survive and craft a livelihood for themselves, find themselves being activists because they have to resist some of the larger forces at work to displace them. And so there is something small that has developed between ourselves in our research center with lawyers for human rights, as well as some grassroots other organizations, working with cohorts of land and housing right activists through research, capacity building, coalition building, campaigns, supporting litigation. But also beyond that, starting to shape policy and priorities. And I'll say something more about that just now. But the whole policy piece has become quite important for us, so that there are the actions on the ground, but how does the action support the policy? and how does policy also support the actions of grassroots activists and practitioners. Increasingly, we are trying to be in conversation with other social movements. For example, in our country, we are working in close collaboration with different friends and partners in Cape Town, people who work on land and housing issues, grassroots social movements. So there's on the one hand, the connection with grassroots social movements, but there's also, on the other hand, the connection with UN Habitat. For the first time in 2022, there has been a global a resolution passed by the UN, which all member states are adhere to in terms of ending homelessness through affordable housing. And so, although we know the UN often doesn't have much teeth, it is handy as a way to engage our own state in terms of advocacy and policy as a signatory to that resolution. One example of the way in which homelessness and housing plays itself in our context is where our center has started to work with a public interest law firm and a faith-based organization, where these three elements we see working in tandem: the importance of grassroots action and coming alongside and journeying with, in relationship, people with lived experience, but also the importance of data and evidence if we want to change policy. And then the whole agenda of influencing policy and budgets, sometimes through litigation. There are a number of examples of good litigation that created precedents in different cities in South Africa that can be used, for example, when there's certain actions by local governments or by the police towards people in informal settlements, towards people who are homeless or otherwise precarious. And so we try to keep track of some of the precedent cases so that can also assist us in the advocacy that is done. 2 years ago, October 2022, we did the first citywide homeless count, and we called it "Everyone Counted Counts." That got a bit of appeal with the city for the first time. And so we have a new deputy mayor that's actually really a champion for this issue. Just last week, we had a homeless summit where different people came together, people with lived experience who are on the streets, who came from the streets, other stakeholders, non-profits, the deputy mayor herself, and city officials, wanting to see how the data from the count can translate in strategies and in actual budgeted for implementation, so that citywide people can actually make a dent when it comes to issues of homelessness. So that's the first picture I briefly wanted to share with you. The second picture is a one-year program called Leadership in Urban Transformation. We currently run it for faith-based practitioners in Pretoria, Cape Town, and potentially in Durban. There at the bottom, you can see an advert that the people in Durban has distributed. And it focuses on personal, ecclesial, organizational, and systemic transformation, working with cohorts of people that are actually deeply involved in their own context already, but to take a step back and say, we don't want to just act. We also want to reflect on what we do. We want to become better at what we do. And currently, we also expand this program into what will hopefully by 2026 be a hybrid MPhil program. And the nice thing of the MPhil, I think, Viv, in your case, you spoke of a MA. The attractive thing for an MPhil in the South African context is that people from various disciplines can enroll for this program, not only people with a prior theological degree. So if people are wanting to make a difference in terms of urban change from different disciplines, they would be able to enroll. But we will use the same logic of this program. It's a very praxis-based pedagogy, focusing or assuming in the right block that you can see there, assuming an incarnational presence somewhere in a community, focusing on action, reflection, helping people to develop critical tools of analysis, helping people to foster imaginative sources, and all of it aimed at supporting transformational ministry. The third picture is our approach to research. And I want to use three words that is important to us in our Center for Faith and Community: embodied, transdisciplinary, and long-term. We want to be present in spaces relationally. So much of our research is not desktop. Most of it is in communities and with communities. We've learned from Paul Chatterton and other geographers in Leeds in the UK who speaks about solidarity action research. So research as being in solidarity with communities. It's very transdisciplinary in the definition of Judy Klein, different disciplines working with communities and practitioners to find solutions for real-life challenges. And it is quite long-term. A friend of mine speaks of what he calls guerrilla ethnography, academics going in to write articles to get promotions, and it's short-term, it is exploitative, it's extractive. How can we foster models of research as accompaniment, as slow journeys with communities, with the emphasis on solidarity and mutuality, so that those who are the researchers can be transformed as much as the communities in which we find ourselves? One example is something we call our Urban Studio program, where we really want to embrace and affirm the city itself as our classroom and teacher. So shifting the geography of the theological classroom. Those are 6 spaces in our city, very different, where we have a long-term presence, 3 inner city spaces, 2 spaces on the outskirts of the city, which is marked by informality, and there at the bottom, an interesting space, a growing informal settlement in one of the wealthiest neighborhoods in our city, alongside the largest church with 7,500 seats. And so in these 6 areas, we journey slowly with communities in various ways, doing engaged evidence-based research that supports local action, documenting local practices, building leadership where required, and advocating for change, or often just doing research that the communities ask for that can help them in the work of advocacy that they are doing. A stupid little example is this map at the bottom. It is in one of the communities, there's a plan to redevelop the area. And the local community says it's good and fine that government wants to consult us, but we have never read maps before or plans, so we can't really make inputs into what they are saying they're going to do in this community, and yet they want us to participate. And so in this case, for example, we are involving urban planners and others to support the community in developing basic skills to be able to engage in a more equal way in public participation processes about the future of this community. But a lot of this is also about making visible what's often made invisible. In one of the communities we're working during COVID, the campus of the university closed down, churches closed down, local government closed down. But there are 100 community-based organizations and just local community people that did amazing work and still does amazing work to feed hungry people, to support people with disabilities and old people, to run childcare programs. And we started to really understand them as the real city makers, the people in those places where very little infrastructure, very little political support is given. There are people that make huge change. They are like the glue of the community, that if they are not allowed to continue, those communities will fall apart. The last picture, I'll wrap up with that, is something that developed a few years ago. Nairobi was a part of that, or at least Sheth and others in Nairobi, called Urban Africa 2050, Imagining Theological Education for Flourishing African Cities. And what it simply was to bring 15 cities and 15 theological institutions in conversation with each other quite relationally, asking a few questions. What will those cities look like by 2050? How are our curricula and our institutions preparing a generation of transformational urban leaders? People who can connect incarnationally at the grassroots, who shape transformative faith communities, but who are also equipped to engage urban power and systems in redemptive ways. How do we imagine flourishing African cities? Can we even think of flourishing in the context of places like Kibera, Matare, and other such settlements? How do we center the urban majority theologically and politically? What does that look like? And so that's been the journey and the ongoing journey of some institutions and some individuals in these cities. And we slowly stewarding it. And hopefully over time, we can also find synergy with others in this space today. So I think this is my last slide. And I think, Verv, that is part of what you asked also. So the question probably is, how do we grow this movement from below? Where is the spirit? Where is the spirit at work in cities across the continent? Recently, Chinyama Hamwinda in Zambia moved from a smaller city to Lusaka with the express vision and purpose to create a center for urban mission. And so he's been on our case for quite a while to say, how can we in relationship? There are many people like that. Sometimes we're aware of them, sometimes they are hidden all across the continent. Where is the spirit at work in cities across the continent? And how do we genetically connect to each other? How do we, as a movement, care for urban people, places, and land? With climate change, of course, affecting the poorest among us. Cape Town just recently went through very harsh storms just 2 weeks ago. And again, it was accentuated that the effects of climate always affects the urban poor the most, also the rural. But when we talk cities, the urban poor. How does the oikos, the household of God, help shape or transform the police, the city in life-affirming ways? Who should be connected and how best should we be connected to be faithful to what God has called us to do? Thank you. That was what I would have wanted to share with you.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Khan. I think we will take these presentations one at a time because there's a lot of information, very rich, very informative, so that we reflect on it before we appreciate Doctors Steven and Rosemary and the team for joining us. I know your time comes immediately after this. So I want to throw it back to the floor if there are questions or comments, and I think Stefan will be able to respond to that. I just couldn't help but realize that your presentation is really futuristic, because at the top page of your presentation was 2023. Okay? I don't have any comments or any questions for Stefan. There is heat in the room. A bit of a dance. We join ourselves. Okay, so
I think that it's a lot of information to process for now. I think it's a lot of information to process for now, and it's deep. So if he can share it with us, maybe we'll find time tomorrow morning to go back to it for a few minutes, so that we'll be able to share our thoughts and all that, if it's possible.
Thank you, Stefan, for taking the trouble amidst the internet and the distractions and being very, mindful of us, caring for us to share what's in your heart and in this vision and presenting those 4 pictures. Just, I like what you said, where is the Holy Spirit at work? And indeed, when you start mentioning figures such as 15 cities and 15 theological institutions, I wonder if you were in my head. Or if you were in some of these discussions that we've been having this morning. So really, thank you. I'm resonating with what you are saying, and the team here that's face-to-face physically is resonating with what you are saying. So thank you so very much.
Thank you so much, Stefan. Even though I joined the group like in the last few minutes of your presentation, so I like the idea of the city being the learning environment and having that as a studio. I like the way you phrased it. In terms of learning environment, I'm wondering what you do when you have students in the spaces that you have shown us. So do you have students that are in the inner city exposed to other environments out there, out of the inner city, where they can also do some learning so that they can also get some exchange and also gain from infrastructure, experience from other infrastructure. And here I have in mind, when we take theological education to the slums, in my opinion, we also need to be careful that I think that we are not confining the people living in the slums to only experience everything within the slums. Do we give them opportunity also to learn in other contexts so that their interactions between the different geographical locations are also informing their experience and transforming them? Thank you.
Do you want to respond to that shortly? Okay.
You want me to respond? Yeah. Thank you so much. I think the first one was more a comment. Thank you for that comment, and I'm glad we seem to be in synergy, and I trust that that can grow. Of course, many of you in Nairobi I've known for a long time, so it will be strange if we don't have some form of synergy. In terms of the question you just raised, very good question. I think of course, there are different groups. In that 1 year program I talked about is typically people who are deeply embedded and incarnated in different contexts already. Those are maybe slightly older people. They might be in their 30s or 40s, have some experience of ministry, often have more questions than answers, which I think is the ideal theological student. So they come with questions, and they really want to reflect quite deeply and are open to also deconstruct some of the things they have held dear that might not necessarily work in the context they find themselves. But then if you talk of young seminarians or Bible school students or so on, I don't know in your context. In my context, it's almost like people come to the university to get a degree to help them get out of poverty. Middle-aged white guy like me try to encourage people to continue to engage with poverty. It's like, who do you think you are? And so it's a tricky one, because education is a way to shift in terms of class. What we are trying to do is to expose also our young theological students to various spaces. I'm, for example, responsible for the so-called community engagement modules, but I've changed it and call it engaged communities. And I deliberately did so to say, who are we as 21-year-olds or 30 years olds or as a white guy to go into communities that we know very little of and think we're going to make this huge change by pitching up a few times. So we try to change the pedagogy to say, go into these places and let these places become the teacher. So the idea is not that I go and teach, but that I go and learn from these spaces, and that the people living in these spaces, the practitioners, but also the people living here, are the people that teach us. Maybe just one other comment. A very favorite way for me of teaching is what we call mobile classrooms, where we basically get into public transport or so, and we make a point of moving. We have the one class, for example, we do from 8 in the morning till 8 at night, and in that time we probably visit 10, 12 neighborhoods, and we are exposed to a diversity of voices, competing voices, different voices, from suburbs to informal settlements to inner city housing estates. Yeah, to just expose people not only to struggles, but also to those places of hope, to the places in which we sense the spirit is busy doing innovative things and things that we can learn from. So those will be some of my responses to what you asked. But I think there must be something deliberate. In whatever we do, we must be deliberate. And I think part of the deliberate is to shift the classroom to spaces that, to shift the classroom, but also to shift. I mean, this big word that people use for it is about epistemic justice. Where does knowledge about the city reside? And it doesn't always reside in the powerful theological institutions. I think often the solutions and the wisdoms that we need to find is hidden in other places. And part of our work is to find those places and to expose people to that in our theological formation.